Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Plitt, as I understand it, a great proportion of the aid which is provided by USAID is provided to the UN, which then furthers the support for various entities throughout the Middle East. Is that a fair assessment?
I would say a large portion is particularly on the humanitarian assistance front, where we have a strong partner in the World Food Program.
Why do we not provide that directly as opposed to using the UN? And the reason I say that is because obviously there are other forces in the UN that are not necessarily aligned with our interests. And providing funding to the UN to provide humanitarian resources suggests the opportunity for that to be not necessarily diverted, but perhaps not as carefully watched and as carefully attributed to the United States. If we send money to the UN and then out goes, UN packaging that says, here, this is given to you by the UN, it's like, wait, why don't we just send it directly from ourselves? Why do we use the UN as the vehicle for providing humanitarian aid in the Middle East?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. I believe the principal reason why we do channel much of our humanitarian assistance to the UN is because they are present on the ground in a lot of these places which are non-permissive, and they've had a long presence, and certainly in the case of the World Food Program, they have the most extensive reach in terms of ensuring the food security to the populations. Places like Yemen, 2/3 of the population is dependent on humanitarian aid. It is very difficult to work in that environment with the behavior of the Houthis, and the UN is present on the ground. We are cognizant of the need to brand our aid and ensure that the American people get credit for that aid. And so we do that as much as possible, both through the UN and through our international NGO partners that we have who work alongside the UN in these difficult environments.
Yeah, I'm thinking about, for instance, in Gaza, the chairman read a statement indicating from USAID that, hey, there haven't been resources diverted to go to Hamas. At the same time, the people of Gaza support Hamas, voted for Hamas. It's their government, if you will, and that's been their choice to have Hamas. If the UN provides food to all the people in Gaza, that would include not just those that voted for Hamas, but also Hamas fighters. I mean, Hamas fighters are going to eat as well, and I'm sure the UN doesn't say, okay, here, you get in line here, but anyone from Hamas, you can't eat. I mean, so it doesn't have to have diversion for there to be, if you will, USAID through UN providing food and other assistance, medicines and so forth to members of Hamas. Is that right?
I think I would respond to that by advising that there are 2.2 million Palestinians in Gaza who are desperate. I would reemphasize Special Envoy's Setterfield's is that we don't have any indication that our aid through the UN has been diverted. I mean, I don't think we can make any guarantees with 2.2 million people that a member of Hamas doesn't get a sandwich here and there, but the desperation that exists, the food security situation that exists, requires that we work with vetted partners and those on the ground to ensure that the needs of desperate civilians are met.
Ms. O'Donnell, same sort of concern that I'd raised with history at UNESCO. It's obviously been seen as being anti-Semitic in the past. And we have withdrawn from UNESCO. President Biden reestablished relations with UNESCO. You said that you would combat the anti-Semitism that has been consistently part of UNESCO's history. How do you combat that? Isn't the best way to combat it to basically say we're not going to participate, we're not going to provide funding to UNESCO, we're not going to be supportive of an anti-Semitic, anti-Israeli oriented organization?
Thank you for the question, Senator Romney. And I fully believe, like our president, that multilateral institute, you just referenced some of the flaws and concerns with the UN system. I sit here today eyes wide open to those flaws, and I think it's even more important that we have our seat at the table to represent not just the interests of the US, but those of our allies and partners. And I do think we know what happens when the US leaves the stage, and it's incredibly critical that we be there. And I think, how do we do that? We do that by partnering with the like-minded member states who are part of the UNESCO and being a part of coalition building to bring others on to this case. And I think I will bring, if confirmed to this role, my experience having worked on the first ever national strategy to combat anti-Semitism that we rolled out as part of the administration with Second Gentleman Douglas Emhoff. And I will bring a conviction to ensure that anti-Israel bias in all of its forms is warded against.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And appreciate these executives taking time away from your responsibilities at your respective companies to be here and to inform us, and in some cases to get berated by us and give us an opportunity to pontificate on our various topics, which I'm about to do. One is that I fully concur with Mr. Paul, or Senator Paul indicated just a moment ago, Rand Paul, and that is that a free enterprise system works marvelously. And I know we keep asking you, what are you doing to try and reduce the prices of your products? The answer is that's not what happens in free enterprise and capitalism. I hope it doesn't come as a shock to my colleagues. In capitalism, if you're running an enterprise where you have a fiduciary responsibility to your owners, you try and get as high a price as you can. That's what you try and do. You try and make as much profit as you can. That's how free enterprise works. You think Chevrolet sits back and says, gosh, how can we get the price of the Chevrolet down? No, it's like, how high a price can I get and maximize the profit for my shareholder? What price does McDonald's charge for a sandwich? As high a price as they can get. But the amazing thing about free enterprise is that someone figured out that if everybody does that and you have competition among all the players, that somehow the prices come down and the quality goes up and the access to the product is broader. It's the marvel, it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, but it's the marvel of capitalism. Now, obviously, wise companies say, well, you don't just raise prices to the roof and do things that are going to harm your credibility and the trust in the marketplace and have your employees not want to work there because they're going to figure they're working for bad people. So wise enterprises don't just do all the things I just mentioned. They also say we're going to do other things and care for the poor and care for people who want to come work in our company. We do those things too. But recognize free enterprise is about enterprises battling each other with higher prices in many cases, and then they get pushed out by people develop new products and put them out of business. It's how it works. But let me turn to, and I know, as Senator Paul indicated, there's some who'd like price controls. There's some who'd like socialized medicine. And it's like, have you seen what that produces? It doesn't produce new drugs. It doesn't produce cures. It sounds great. We're going to set up, price controls is just another name for capitalism, socialism light. Our system works, but there are ways to improve it. And I'm very concerned that this disparity between list price and what you actually get paid is a problem. And I don't know why it's a problem or what we can do about it. But do you have PBMs and getting prices and discounts like this in other countries that you compete in? Yes, Mr. Berner, yeah.
Senator, we do not. This is a unique element of the U.S. healthcare system.
Is that true for you also, Mr.
That
Davis?
is true for us as well.
And Mr. Gatto, is that also true?
This is unique. The inequity that exists in the U.S. is because of that we have higher out-of-pocket costs for patients than anywhere else in the developed world.
So I hope we focus on this. We may not have the right bad guys here, all right? These are the guys developing cures and helping people solve diseases. But we have something here they don't have in the rest of the world. These PBMs that want higher and higher list prices because they get paid based on how high the list price is, because they get a % of the list price. I'm not sure where all the money goes. Some of it goes back to patients. Some goes to the companies if they're self-insured. I don't know where it all goes, but I think that's the issue. So let me ask each of you, if you were in our shoes, knowing what you know, what should we be doing to try and get the cost of products down to our to the people of the country and to the country at large, to the government that buys a lot of goods, a lot of drugs? What should we be focused on? And I know that you sell to PBMs, so you got to be careful not to step on their toes too hard because they might punish you. But what advice would you give us? What should we be looking at? Where's the problem in this mess? We'll start here, Mr. Berner.
Maybe three things I would offer up, Senator.
Yeah.
First, to the complexity that you just described. Number one, delink profits from intermediaries from the list price of the drug and the rebates, rather, that are provided. If you could delink that, that would be important. And alternatively, require that those rebates be passed on to lower out-of-pocket costs for patients. That's number one. Number two, I firmly believe we have the ability to help lower out-of-patient costs in Medicare if we could provide the same types of copay support that we do on the commercial side to Medicare patients. That would be a second thing. And the third thing, we've referenced it before, we do innovative contracting outside of the U.S. where we get paid if our product works. There are constraints on our ability to do that in the U.S. I would like to see those removed. That would be very helpful.
Great, thank you. Mr. Davis?
I would say that Chris basically covered all of the things we would also look to do.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, three things as Mr. Berner. I would make sure that the rebates and discounts that we pay to PBMs go back to patients to reduce out-of-pocket costs. I will make sure that, as we are trying to do, and I know this committee is looking into that, would delink the compensation of the PBMs from the list price. And finally, I would sit down to see what we can do to provide a patient assistance program for patients in Medicare Part D, but also look to further lower the out-of-pocket cost for patients that the IRA is bringing.
Thank you. You did mention the fact that the PBMs are largely owned by the insurance companies. So sometimes we think PBMs are going to be lowering our costs as an employer, let's say, and you hire a PBM to lower your costs, but it might lower your costs, but then it's passing on their profit to the insurance company. Is that a problem? Is the fact that the PBMs are owned by the insurance companies, is that a problem here? Is that something we need to look at as well? Do any of you have any comment on that?
The three PBMs are owned by the three largest insurance companies, and together they control about 80% of the market of the prescriptions in the U.S.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in free enterprise, as you can tell by my opening comments. At the same time, I'm concerned that we've got some structures here that are anti-competitive and make markets less effective, and we probably ought to focus on some of those. Thank you. Appreciate your testimony.
Thank you. Senator Baldwin.
To provide military weapons for Ukraine is the most important vote we will ever take as United States senators. We're not being asked to send American troops into war. We are asked to help the Ukrainians defend themselves. If we fail to help Ukraine, Putin will invade a NATO nation. He may delay his next invasion until he rebuilds his decimated military. But we must be clear-eyed. Ukraine is not the end. It is a step. If we fail to help Ukraine, China will eventually absorb Taiwan. If we fail to help Ukraine, we will abandon our word and our commitment, providing to our friends a view that America cannot be trusted. The Chinese Communist Party is already spreading propaganda using our delay as a warning to Taiwan that the United States will not be there to help in the face of China's threat. If we fail to help Ukraine, NATO, the alliance that's prevented great power conflict for over 75 years, will falter and eventually disintegrate. If we fail to help Ukraine, America will cease to be the arsenal of democracy. It will cease to be the leader of the free world. We will be replaced by the authoritarians, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. If we fail to help the Ukraine, we'll be known not as our fathers and mothers were, the greatest generation, but as the worst generation. Now, for months, I've listened to the arguments for denying help to the Ukrainian people. I've observed that the reasons have evolved over time. First, it was claimed that Europe was not paying their fair share. That was proven incorrect. Our allies have already contributed more than $96 billion in aid, and the EU earlier this month agreed to provide $54 billion more over the next 4 years. Next, it was argued that we should instead focus on the Pacific and Taiwan. But Taiwan and Japan and South Korea tell us that the single best thing we can do to dissuade China's aggression is to support Ukraine. Next, we were told that we couldn't afford $60 billion for Ukraine-related funding. But somehow we can afford an $850 billion annual defense budget and annual trillion-dollar deficits, which has happened under both former President Trump and President Biden. Next, it was claimed that we would have insufficient weapons to defend America and Israel if we send more weapons to Ukraine. But the Department of Defense has explained that helping Ukraine will actually strengthen our national security by helping to rebuild our depleted military-industrial base. The latest excuse for denying aid to Ukraine is that this bill is a clever disguise to set up an impeachment of Donald Trump at some point in the future. Under this so-called logic, Trump has to be elected, Democrats have to win the House, and those Democrats have to be unable to find any other indiscretion of Donald Trump's upon which to base an impeachment. Now, I know that the shock jocks and online instigators have effectively riled up many in the far reaches of my party. But if your position is being cheered by Vladimir Putin, it's time to reconsider your position. Now, I can't see into the future, but there are no guarantees that Ukraine will defeat Russia. But that does not mean that we should stand back and let Putin have his way with Europe. What sending weapons to Ukraine does do is help discourage further Russian and Chinese invasions, which could draw us in. It helps preserve NATO. It allows America to remain the leader of the free world. And it shows that we honor our word to our friends and allies. Lech Walesa, the first democratically elected president of Poland since 1926, and someone I've been fortunate enough to meet with, recently wrote to all the United States senators. He said this, quote, "You're obliged to assure a peaceful future for your children. Our grandchildren will never forgive us if we fail to stop Russia now. If the U.S. does not lead, nobody will." End of quote. Couldn't agree more. Helping a free people defend their freedom is simply the right thing to do. Thank you, Madam President.
Madam President. Senator from Maine.
Senator Romney, followed by Senator Stabenow. Senator Romney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's appropriate that this hearing is being held during Academy Award season. I'm afraid what we do here is more Barbie than it is Oppenheimer. The public thinks we work on the budget, but we don't. You realize in the time I've been in this committee, we've never met privately. We've never come together and negotiated and given some give and take and come up with proposals to somehow get us closer to a balanced budget or deal with the debt. Frankly, the only time we meet is in these hearings. And if you've been watching over the 118th Congress, you realize that we've had 28 hearings before today. Do you know how many of those hearings have been on the budget? 2. Now, I'm concerned about the climate, but 14 of our hearings have been on climate change. For instance, the cost of oil dependence in a low-carbon world, how climate change is changing the insurance market, the real cost of fossil fuels, how the climate crisis threatens ocean industries. These are important topics. They just don't belong in the Budget Committee. This is a committee that's about performing, getting on stage and acting like we care about these things, but there's actually no work being done by this committee to deal with our budget and to deal with federal spending. Now, we pretend we're going to be bringing down the deficit, but the administration is comparing our spending to the COVID years. And any American knows that we spent a massive amount of money to deal with the COVID crisis and to help American families. And pretending like we're cutting the deficit when we're comparing to a COVID year is absurd. Now, people on both sides of the aisle, including economists, say that the increase in debt is unsustainable, that raising debt as a percentage of the GDP cannot go on forever. And we're apparently not in the position to do the job because we won't even meet to talk about it. So my question is, does the administration support the idea brought forward by Senator Manchin and myself in our chamber, but also in the House by two leaders there, to put in place a bipartisan, bicameral commission to look at ways to see if we can't hold the debt as a percentage of the GDP at a constant level? Does the administration support that legislation?
Senator, there are lots of commissions. The House, the Budget Committee just passed a fiscal commission. I won't pick amongst commissions that are flowing.
Fine,
but
you think that's a good idea?
But what I will say is, it will take bipartisan solutions to deal with our fiscal path. We're putting a path forward here. I know you may not agree on our revenue proposals.
But you see, in order to have a proposal that actually becomes law, it takes both sides to come together. I can put a proposal out there that I know has no chance of passing and pretend like I'm doing something responsible. The administration puts a proposal out it knows has no chance whatsoever passing because we have Republicans and Democrats. We have to come together and work together, but we don't. So look, it's this sleight of hand, which is look at all the things we're doing. We get a proposal that makes it work. You don't have a proposal that actually would get accomplished because you can't bring together both parties to do it. The sleight of hand, I mean, the president said the other night that these wealthy, I think billionaires he was describing, pay only 8% in tax. Well, what he didn't say was that he wasn't talking about an income tax. I mean, it was very disingenuous. A sleight of hand, again, Academy Awards worthy. He's not talking about the income tax they pay. He knows the income tax that those people pay is a very high rate, as it should be. He's talking about putting in place a tax on the increase in value of their assets, so-called unrealized capital gains. I don't know of any country in the world that does that. Do you?
If I can talk about this in a way, if those unrealized...
Are there any countries in the world that tax unrealized capital gains?
Senator, if those unrealized gains are good enough to take to a bank to get hundreds of millions of dollars or billions in loans,
I asked a different question, and I get to ask the questions that I want, and I hope to get a response from you. I don't believe there's any country in the world that taxes assets or unrealized capital gains. I believe France tried it for a while and found it was a disaster and gave it up. But the president's proposing doing it and telling the American people they're only paying 8%. They're not paying 8% on their income. That's disingenuous. And by the way, I think it's the stupidest idea I've ever heard. Would devastate our economy. I'm not worried about how much money the billionaires are going to be paying in taxes. That's not my concern. It's the idea that we'd be transferring everything from the public markets into private assets that couldn't be valued easily. Look, I would describe as well the other proposals made sounding as if they have a chance of passing. They don't. We need to work as a committee and as a Congress to stop acting for the cameras and start working for the American people to finally deal with the massive deficits and debt that we have. And that's not happening. That's why Senator Manchin and I have proposed a bipartisan, bicameral commission to finally tackle this before it becomes such a crisis it can't be resolved without calamity. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Director Curry, and appreciate the work that you do and that all of our panel members do to help protect our citizens and our land. I'm going to direct my first question to Director Barnes, but you others are free to comment on it as well. Director Barnes, you noted the importance of forestry management, but said that there are regulatory barriers that make it difficult for us to effectively manage our forests. What are the barriers that the Commission identified, or just based on your own experience, what things should we focus on to be able to make it more likely that we'll be able to effectively manage the forest prior to a wildfire?
Yeah, thanks, Senator Romney. So I think some of those barriers are definitely the NEPA process that we're going through. Permitting reform is something that we definitely need to be focusing on. Also, efficiencies across agencies is something that we should be focusing on, and how we can do better planning efforts. Honestly, in Utah, we do things very well with our interagency partners. I often tell people, if everybody could do it the Utah way, the world would be a lot better. We've worked on that very hard through shared stewardship, but I think breaking down those barriers through NEPA, the litigation issues that we see that are very costly, and then also the alignment, getting everything aligned to have a project happen. That's a tricky thing for things to happen. Air quality, if you're doing prescribed fire, permitting, everything lining up all together to make things work, it becomes complicated and complex at times.
I'm going to add that to this question, just personal observation, having driven through a number of the forests in our state. I was astounded to see that in some cases, perhaps as much as 2/3 of the wood, of the trees, are dead. And if they're harvested, I'm told within 3 years or so, they can be used for chipboard and so forth. But the process of getting a permit to harvest this dead wood takes so long that it's no longer useful, and therefore has no economic value. Therefore, we can't get loggers to come in and take out the dead wood. Does the commission make any recommendations that would allow us to actually use some of the dead wood and to get private sector participants to come in and remove some of the fuel that adds to the danger of these wildfires?
Absolutely, and that's an important piece of the puzzle in Utah. And again, through shared stewardship, that's one of the approaches that we have taken. We have invested in a position of a wood utilization specialist within the division, and having that person to determine what wood is out there, how can we utilize that wood, and how can we get that wood off to the forest to be an economic benefit in the state is something that we're very focused on, and we're starting to build success in that area. It's a very important topic.
Thank you. I'd be happy to hear from any other member of the panel that would like to address this as well. Yes, Director?
Thank you. One of the commission recommendations does point to the needed continuing and additional needed investment in biomass utilization technologies and investments in those businesses. Because much of this, the wood in the West, particularly in Ponderosa Pine area, is very low or no value. And we need to look at other ways that we can create value out of those products. So continuing investments in those areas is going to be critical.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me turn to another topic that you raised, which is the workforce and the pay. Again, Director Barnes, you indicated a desire to provide the appropriate pay between state and local individuals, but there's been discussion about the difference in pay with federal as well as state and local, and how those compare and the conflict that may exist. Likewise, in this regard, there's some discussion about full-time versus part-time. And at the federal level, we have part-time individuals. Who wants to take a job that's going to require you to have a salary or provide a salary for you maybe 5 or 6 months a year, but the rest of the year you got no pay? Are there solutions in this regard that you all have that we need to consider?
Yeah, Senator Romney. So recently, a couple years ago, Utah passed HB 65, which increased wildfire pay. We increased that and brought people up to the level which we felt was comparable with federal pay of federal wildland firefighters. Right now, we feel that Utah is in a good place compared with our federal partners, but there is still that compensation bracket with regard to benefits. Some of our time-limited firefighters that fight fire just throughout the season do not receive a benefits package, so that's also an important piece of that puzzle. Bringing people on, as we talked about, fire season is not just fire season anymore, it's fire year. So compensating is very important. It's also very important to not have a swift difference in firefighter pay from agency to agency. When a fire happens, it knows no boundary. We're all out on the landscape, we're working together, we're working to put that fire out. So if you're a state wildland firefighter or you're a federal wildland firefighter, we should all be making an amount that is similar so that there's no difference in what these people are doing out there in saving our resources.
Thank you. Any other individuals, please?
Please,
Dr.
thank you,
Merrill.
Senator, for that. I'd just like to, if I may, transition just a bit to our local firefighters. As you've noted, there is a shortage of wildland firefighters, but certainly we're having a shortage in the structural side as well. And it's up to the structural firefighters to often cover on federal, state lands, regardless. They are the first boots on the ground, not a federal firefighter. And so our local firefighters, and I'd like to express my gratitude certainly to the Senate for already have passed the SAFER Act. This is critical to making sure that we can continue to recruit structural firefighters across the nation because we are on the edge of a shortage nationwide.
Thank you. Any others have any comment? If not, I'm going to turn to Senator Butler and let her take over. Obviously, we're very much aware of the tragedies and the wildfires that have occurred in California in recent years. Appreciate your being here. And Senator Scott, I'm going to ask some questions now, and then when the chair returns, she'll, I think, provide Senator Langford the opportunity to speak, and then we'll finally get to Senator Blumenthal. A couple of questions. There's a great deal being written about the degree of leakage, if you will, of things that are not supposed to be exported from our country or from our friends that are somehow getting in the hands of adversaries of one kind or another. How great a problem do you think that is? I mean, how much, how many, I mean, is this a tiny share of those things that are most sensitive, or is this a pretty significant problem that we need to address? And any one of you can respond to that. Maybe I'll go over to Mr. Mancuso, which is this, and I realize we got a lot of things on the list, and so some things they're not terribly interested in, but I'm thinking particularly about large-scale chips that go into AI or other key defense technologies. How much of that is getting through, do we think? Is this, are we a sieve? Are we, you know, not really a sieve, but drip, drip, drip? What's kind of the characterization of what's getting around our export controls?
Thank you for that question. I can say this, as the Assistant Director for Global Trade, I think the sheer volume of legitimate trade far outweighs the illicit trade that's going on. However, that small slice is of concern. So what you have is you have folks at this table, all the 20 partners at the E2C2, the intelligence community, all of us are completely laser focused on retaining America's innovation, our creativity, our intellectual property right. We develop the most advanced weapon systems in the world. Because of our ability to create this, we are the envy of the entire world. That also means our adversaries will stop at nothing to obtain this technology in these weapon systems. So with that being said, we are focused on this issue. We are an investigative agency looking at these agencies, attempting to disrupt and dismantle the flow of this technology. And it concerns all of us. Like I said, we're focused. I'm also concerned the day that they don't want our technology, the day that we aren't the world leader, because that means that they've surpassed us and they've become superior. And all of us at this table are laser focused, making sure that day never happens.
Yeah, I think there's a recognition that with regards to AI in particular, it's very difficult to control the software. And some software on AI has already been put on open source and represents, in my view, a huge breach of poor judgment, or breach of good judgment, and it is poor judgment. And there are some who believe that the only way we're going to try and keep AI from being used in a most negative way is if we limit the supply of the chips necessary to operate AI. Are we able to do that successfully, or is it like, no, we really can't? Mr. Curlin, do you have a sense of that?
So at BIS, Senator, we have been imposing controls not only on entities that are involved in these types of diversionary attempts, but we have over the past year and a half rolled out a series of significant countrywide controls on China, in addition to parties not only that are resident there, but there are actors that are sitting in third countries as well. It is a complex problem set, and certainly with regards to the semiconductor ecosystem, where the vast majority of chips that are produced offshore, trying to identify potential violators is something that we all here are working hard to do, using all source intelligence, putting together analytical cells that are trying to identify those activities, working hand in hand with industry to both prevent on the front side, And then if there are violations, to have penalties that are high enough to deter others is critical. We've been doing that as an interagency. We've issued over a dozen multi-sealed documents just in the past year and a half that's trying to get at this problem set is how do we get industry to harden their supply chains and their distribution networks? And then we're working globally, internationally. Chair Hassan mentioned some of the complications of our international partners. In most of these jurisdictions, the licensing folks are actually disconnected from the enforcement folks, right? And that creates a bit of a gap because the enforcement folks don't know what's coming into the system that's being licensed, and the licensing folks don't actually know what's going out, which is the biggest vulnerability, the things that should be coming into the system that aren't. And so we've been working very closely. We have attachés similar to HSI that are stationed now in 10 countries around the globe, trying to get our international partners to increase their capacity to identify and then take enforcement action in coordination with us. It's a challenge, but we're using all the tools at our disposal, industry, interagency, international, to try to get at making sure that these key technologies aren't getting into those hands. And where we identify it, we're either using criminal enforcement, administrative enforcement, or as I mentioned just this morning, we added 4 companies to our entity list in China that were explicitly diverting AI chips to the Chinese military weapons program so that we can alert industry and have them harden their supply chains when they're doing their due diligence of transactions.
And what will the penalties be for those corporations that have been, if you will, shipping those chips into China?
Sure. So they would be subject to criminal and/or administrative enforcement authority. So 20 years, up to 20 years in jail, or $1 million per fine. And then on the administrative side, we have a statutory maximum of $365,000, or twice the value of each violation. And as in the case of Seagate, that resulted in a $300 million penalty to set a deterrence level to say, we expect companies to put in place internal compliance programs where they're screening their transactions, and then when they find a problem, to come to us voluntarily through what we call a voluntary self-disclosure to tell us. Because if they don't do it, and there's a willful action or there's knowledge, then we're going to take aggressive action to try to deter others from shortchanging, and also putting those that are investing in compliance programs at a competitive disadvantage. So we want to level that playing field at the same time.
Ms. Choi, who's been the most successful in being able to get the key technologies that are vital and we have endeavored to restrict? Is it China or is it Russia? We read stories about Russia being able to get technologies that they're using in Ukraine. At the same time, we read about China. Just today, we've read more stories about China getting advantage of our technologies. Are they equally effective, or is one more effective than the other?
Senator Romney, I would say that I would refer you to the IC's annual threat assessment, which focuses on China's efforts in particular. I would say both of those countries pose concerns, but with regard to China, that threat assessment notes that China seeks to become a world science and technology superpower and to use this technological superiority for economic, political, and military gain. And among its various methods to do that, it includes means to acquire or steal IP, its cyber operations, and its illicit procurement. So I would say China is laser focused on trying to advance its science and technology program, and it's a focus for us at the Department of Justice.
Thank you. Senator Langford.
Mr. Romney, thank you. Trying to stay on that timeline. I appreciate that. For those of you who weren't here, our colleagues are all trying to, everybody wants to ask questions. Everybody is scheduling tightly, so if you try to stay to your time, I would appreciate that. Senator Romney, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, in the last 3 1/3 years, during your term, there have been more illegal aliens released into the country than under the 4 prior presidents combined. I know there may be some in the country that applaud that, but I believe that, frankly, if President Biden is to be turned out of office, it will be largely because of that failure on your part and his part as the person who's responsible for policy. I believe, and I think the great majority of the American people believe, and that reason why I think it's such a political bomb for the president, that this is an extraordinary crisis and failure. Do you believe that the numbers that you saw
that Senator Johnson put up, that huge increase in the number of illegal aliens being released into the country, that is a crisis and a terrible problem?
I have, Senator.
That's a yes or no.
Senator, I have said previously that it is a crisis, and it is something that we work to address every single day.
Good, thank you. Let me turn. The House, I believe, House of Representatives, took action to underscore the extent of this crisis. And the Democrats decided they didn't want to spend more time talking about that. But I'm going to ask you a couple questions. They're not intended to be hostile, but the House said that you lied when you said to the House in a hearing that the border was secure. Why did you say the border was secure? Was that a lie? What do you mean by that?
Senator Romney, allow me to assure you that I have honored the oath of office that I have taken more than 5 times in my 22-plus years of federal service.
Let me go back to the question. That's as accurate as it is irrelevant, which is, my question is, you said that the border was secure. What did you mean when you said the border was secure? Is that not a lie?
Senator, you've asked me now if that is a lie, and I have assured you that I have honored the oath of office that I have taken.
In what way was it not a lie then?
Senator, with the resources and authorities that we have, it is as secure as it can be.
Thank you. Second question. The law states, and the House correctly noted, that encounters at the border and people seeking parole and so forth should be detained, and yet you release them. Why did you release them?
Senator, we release individuals into immigration enforcement proceedings when our detention capacity cannot meet them in detention, and they do not pose a threat to public safety or national security based upon the screening and vetting that we perform at the border.
Clearly that screening and vetting was insufficient given the number of murders and other crimes committed by a number of those people so released. But is there a law when the detention facility is full? I understand why you say I can't put them in detention, which the law requires, if there's no more detention space. But does the law indicate what you then do? Because under President Trump, they were sent back to Mexico, as I understand it. And under your administration, they were released into the country. Am I wrong in that assessment?
Yes, you are, Senator, respectfully.
You want to explain in what way?
Of course, because I believe, and I want to be accurate in the data that I provide to you, and so I will verify subsequent to this hearing, Senator. I believe that a total of approximately 70,000 people were processed through the Remain in Mexico policy, and the balance were either detained or placed into immigration enforcement proceedings on a non-detained docket with a notice to appear. That is something that has been characteristic of our broken immigration system.
Do you have any sense of the proportion? How many were sent back to Mexico and how many were released into the country?
I would be pleased to provide that to you subsequently, Senator.
That would be helpful. The law also, and the House correctly noted, that asylum seekers should be evaluated individually, not released en bloc, and yet they were released en bloc. Why is that?
Senator, I don't know to what the House was referring, because we make individualized asylum determinations. Our asylum officers are trained to do so based upon the facts presented to them in each case.
Well, I would refer you to the articles of impeachment, which I presume you've had the chance to read. Is that right?
Actually, I have not read the articles of impeachment.
I probably want to do that because it alleges that you did not follow the law of the United States of America, and either you or your legal counsel ought to read that to make sure that you are following the law of the United States of America. But it indicates that individuals are to be evaluated individually and not let go or not released into the country en bloc, and yet it says that you did release en bloc large numbers of individuals into the country that should have been individually evaluated. Is that the case or not the case?
That is not the case.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've used my time.
Thank you. I appreciate.
What is, because before we get into Ukraine, this hush money case, the president, he's denied these allegations. Do you believe that he did this?
I'm not getting into the trial. There's a trial underway, and the jury will make the decision.
What does it say about his character?
I think everybody has made their own assessment of President Trump's character, and as far as I know, you don't pay someone $130,000 not to have sex with you.
And then on the Ukraine aspect of it, did Speaker Johnson make a mistake by waiting for 2 months to move on this package?
I wish we'd have moved more quickly, but Speaker Johnson got to the right place, and is allowing the majority of the representatives, Republican and Democrat, to make a decision. And that decision will be to provide the funding that Ukraine needs to defend its own freedom and its sovereignty. If we're going to have nations believe that they can just attack one another and take over neighboring nations by virtue of their military might, why, it's a very dangerous world, which would put our own economy in trouble, would obviously put our national security in danger as well.
So you don't think it's too late?
No, I think it's going to be helpful resources for the people of Ukraine to continue to fight against the massive Russian aggressor. Of course, Russia is much larger, a nuclear nation, basically lied about getting the nuclear weapons that Ukraine had. Russia said they would defend Ukraine, and now they're attacking Ukraine.
So amid some of these protests that we're seeing on college campuses, some have suggested or recommended that you be the president at Harvard University. How do you respond to those calls? Even Senator Fetterman has said that he co-signs on the possibility of you taking the helm at the university. Are you actively looking at that position?
No, it's a great compliment, of course, but there are more people that are ready for that position than I.
Senator, what message does this aid package send about America standing on the world stage?
I think it's important for us to follow through on the commitments we made. We said we would defend Ukraine. We are. I can't tell you exactly what the outcome of the conflict will be, but I can tell you if we did not provide the weapons that Ukraine needed, we would be going back on our word, and it would be setting a precedent that would be dangerous for nations around the world.
What do you make of people like Marjorie Taylor Greene going after Mike Johnson, trying to push him out for the speakership because of this decision?
You know, there's some folks who try and get themselves as many tweets, as many followers as they can. A lot of sound and fury signifying nothing.
How concerned are you about American?
What do you make in state after state? There are a sizable number of Nikki Haley voters who continue to vote for her, despite the fact that she has jumped out and not been in the race for months.
Well, I don't think you ever have a candidate that's going to get 100% of the electorate in their favor, whether that's the Republican or the Democrat. President Biden likewise is showing that some folks would like someone else besides him. That's not a surprise.
What do you think
about these people?
of Republicans going to the courthouse in Manhattan with the red ties and the dark suits and saying the case is bogus?
You know, I think it's a little demeaning to show up in front of a courthouse, and particularly one where we're talking about an allegation of paying a porn star. It's really very difficult to watch.
Why is it difficult to watch?
Well, you know, there's a level of dignity and decorum that you expect of people who are running for the highest station in the land, and going out and prostrating themselves in front of the public to try and apparently curry favor with the person who's our nominee is a little embarrassing.
Thanks, Senator.
He is upbeat. He's energetic. I don't know how he does it. He's fired up. But he's also incredibly frustrated that he's not out on the campaign trail. And, you know, look, either way is a political weapon. Either they wear down his resources, they wear down his time, or maybe they spring some kind of bogus conviction.
People like Mitt Romney said you guys are prostrating yourselves by going up there.
Oh, no. Well, what we're doing is going up. Oh, I think the senator's wrong. I think if it was him, he would feel very differently. And we're going up and saying what the president unfairly is not allowed to say.
Astonishing. I'm delighted that we're talking about things related to our deficit. We should have been doing this for a long time, and I appreciate the fact that we are. Recognize, of course, that this is not about gathering information and making decisions. We've never met as a committee on these things privately. You're seeing our full discussion of tax code right now. We're here to perform for an audience, but the joke's on us, because basically no one's watching. Right? This is not something that the American people are tuned into. That doesn't mean it's not important. I will note that things, it's not my quote, but it comes from another famous economist, that things that can't go on forever won't. And continuing to spend massively more than we take in and adding every year massively to the national debt will not go on forever. And unless we deal with it in a constructive way, we will have a financial catastrophe at some point. I can't tell you when it is. Hopefully we'll deal with this issue and don't have the catastrophe, but that's going to be a challenge for us. I would note it's not just spending. It is both spending and taxing. You have to do both in order to reach balance. If somehow
we were able to magically stop all spending other than military that we vote on every year. We eliminated all of government. Kept in place, of course, the entitlements that are mandatory, but all the rest of the government we got rid of. We still have a deficit. So we're going to have to look both at spending and taxing. I keep hearing this idea that there are corporations that are very profitable that pay no tax. Now, I can't figure out how that is. Because if they're following the government tax law that we've written and that Congress has approved and the president signed, and they have a profit, they have to pay a tax on that profit. Is that right, Ms. Anderson?
There are many tax avoidance strategies from
No.
Okay.
Answer the question. If a company follows government tax accounting policies passed by Congress and the president and shows at the end of the year, let's say, $1 million profit, they have to pay a tax on that profit of 21%. Is that right?
Unless they're getting other tax credits that balance that out.
But if they have other tax credits, that means that's following the government account, the things we've passed in Congress. My point is this, which is companies that are profitable under the law that we've passed are paying full taxes. So if you think there are companies out there that are massively profitable that aren't paying taxes, that's just not true.
I wish
what
there
it
was
says
more
is, no, excuse me, I'm speaking now, not your turn. So what that says is, if we don't like the taxes companies are paying, then let's be honest about it and change the federal law. But companies are paying taxes as we have passed them. What's being said is dishonest when people say, oh, all these companies are earning all this money. What they're referring to, I've tried to ask, what are you talking about? They say, oh, we're talking about Wall Street accounting, not government accounting. You see, companies are paying full taxes under government accounting, but then the politicians look at Wall Street accounting and say, oh, they're making profit there, they should pay a tax on that. That's a different matter. So let's be honest in how we deal with that issue. CEO pay as a ratio. The idea you indicated we should pay or charge CEOs based upon the ratio of their pay to their lower employee wages. Do you know what companies would do in that circumstance? Think about unintended consequences. And that is, companies would separate their employees between two different companies. And low-income people would be part of one company, and higher-income people would be part of the other. All right? You have to recognize that the kinds of things you're suggesting have massive unintended consequences. The idea of taxing people based upon their assets, which Dr. Stiglitz suggested we had to do, based on their net worth, not their income, but their net worth. Do you know what that would do? France found out. They tried that. They had 60,000 multimillionaires leave the country over the course of about a decade. They stopped doing it. There's no other country in the world that taxes people based on their assets because they realize people flee when that happens, move assets other places. Unintended consequences. Look, we're going to have to do things that do raise additional revenue, and we're going to have to do things that cut spending. We've got to do both, but we've got to be honest with each other if we're going to do that in a reasonable and fair way. And I would note, just as a small subpoint, the idea of eliminating the tax-free step-up at basis and death is one thing we ought to look at and probably make sense. All right? I do think that when we look at taxes, we have to say, which things can we adjust that won't hurt the growth of the economy? Because most of what's been described today is, in my opinion, going to be highly detrimental to the growth of the economy and the capacity of America to create jobs and lead the world. Don't forget, our economy is leading the world. Don't broke what ain't, or don't try and fix and break what's actually working pretty well. And let's fix things that we can to finally rein in the excessive spending and deficits that we're seeing. Mr. Chairman?
Thank you, Senator Romney. Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Always good.
Thank you, Senator Scott. Senator Romney, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, for the hearing. I'd like to get a sense of, there's a lot of energy and passion around, was it from an animal or was it a lab leak? And I must admit, I don't understand why there's so much energy around that. It strikes me that we'll never be 100% sure, I presume, about one or the other. We might be 98% or something, but we'll always be a little uncertain. And given the fact that it could have been either, we know what action we ought to take to protect from either. And so why there's so much passion around it makes me think it's more political than scientific, but maybe I'm wrong. So the action, it strikes me that based on what I've heard, we shouldn't be financing gain-of-function research. What I heard was there's no particular reason for it other than military warfare. We shouldn't do that anyway. So one, we know that. Whether it came from an animal or not, we shouldn't be financing gain-of-function research. Number two, we should insist that any place we send money follows the international ISO standards. I didn't get the number, Dr. Kobelinks, but you had a number there that suggested that people have to follow. So we shouldn't be getting money or going to labs that don't follow those international standards. And number three, whether it was from a wet market or the Wuhan lab, China's to blame. Both those things were in China. And so if we're looking for someone to blame, we know who it is. It's the Chinese, and they should take responsibility for it and should have opened themselves up to complete disclosure. So am I wrong here? Is there a reason there's so much energy around whether it came from a wet market or a lab? In both cases, the action is simple. We should clean up the wet labs, and number two, we should tighten the wet markets, and number two, we should tighten the labs. What? Please go ahead, Dr. Quay.
Well, I'll just say briefly. I mean, I think the energy is around the fact that paychecks, salaries, careers are based on continuing gain-of-function research by some of the most vocal people in this debate. And I think if you follow the money, you'll see the answer.
Thank you, Dr. Gary. What's your thought?
Well, a lot of the talk around gain-of-function research depends on how you define it, and the definition is very important. I mean, there's some informal definitions that are very technical definitions. I mean, we have to get that part right, because if you define it in a way that basically interferes with a lot of biomedical research on viruses and on other things too, cancer research, everything, you're going to really cripple the biomedical research enterprise. So let's get that right. I don't think, just blanket we should stop funding all gain-of-function research, because some of that is important, like, for developing animal models of new diseases as they come forth. You have to select for a virus that can actually replicate in a distinct animal that you can use in the lab. So if you don't permit gain-of-function research, we won't be able to respond to a new threat because we won't be able to make animal models. So getting that right, getting that definition right is very important. I think that the Office of Science and Technology Policy new guidelines for this type of research is very clear. It's a good step forward. You should look at that and see what you can do best to, to codify that into some kind of legislation.
Yeah, Dr. Ebright, do you concur with that point of view, that we need to define exactly what kind of research is okay and which is not, which has a beneficial purpose and which has only malevolent purpose?
The definition of gain-of-function research has been clear. There is a legally controlling official definition from the U.S. policy that was in effect from 2014 to 2017, and there has been an official legally controlling definition in the U.S. policy that has been in effect from 2018 to the present. The definitions have never been in question, but the intensity that you asked about at the start of your series of questions, the intensity comes from those who are practitioners of gain-of-function research and related high-risk research on potential pandemic pathogens, who have for 2 decades successfully resisted federal oversight of their activities, for 2 decades who have insisted on self-regulation without external oversight, and who would like this to continue, despite the very real possibility, even though, as you say, not a certainty, of the fact, the very real possibility that SARS-CoV-2, a pandemic that killed 20 million and cost 25 trillion, may have come from precisely that category of research. That is the basis of the intensity. Only after there is an acknowledgement, and I see this acknowledgement today in a bipartisan fashion among members of this committee from both parties, only after there is an acknowledgement that there is a very real possibility, not a remote possibility, but a very real possibility of a lab origin,
will there be the political will to impose regulation on this scientific community that has successfully resisted and obstructed regulation for 2 decades? Every other component of biomedical research that poses risks or has significant consequences has regulation, federal regulation with force of law in place. There's regulation of human subjects research. There's regulation of vertebrate animal research. There's regulation of embryonic stem cell research. But in this category of research, which is the most significant in terms of consequences and potentially existential risk, there is almost no regulation with force of law. No regulation with force of law for biosafety for any pathogen other than the smallpox virus, and no regulation with force of law for biorisk management for any pathogen. That needs to change. That's what produces this intensity.
And it strikes me that whether COVID came from a lab or it came from a wet market, that issue still has to be addressed.
Absolutely.
And so I'm not going to get so excited about where COVID happened to come from. What I know is that something very dangerous could come from gain-of-function research if it's not properly regulated. How to define where those boundaries are and what one can do and one can't do, that's something that we ought to be focused on. Even if we became 98% sure it came from a wet market, that wouldn't mean that gain-of-function research could by itself become a huge danger to humanity, and therefore we ought to regulate it. Is that something that you gentlemen agree with, or am I making a mistake on that?
I completely agree with you, Senator Romney. That's well stated.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Romney. Senator Hall, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for holding this hearing. Thanks for the witnesses for being here. You know, I have to say, I think one of the worst things...
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Cassidy. Appreciate the testimony we've heard and your willingness to bring this to our attention in a very clear and convincing way. Obviously, the events that took place under Mr. De La Torre's management at Glenwood and other facilities across the country, including, by the way, 5 hospitals in Utah, was reprehensible and never should have happened. Steward was operating in my state from 2017 to 2023. They understaffed healthcare facilities. They didn't pay for required medical equipment. They failed to meet minimum operating standards. They refused to pay a number of vendors to the tune of about $40 million to vendors in my state. And most importantly, they endangered lives. And it's hard to calculate precisely how many lives have been seriously affected or worse as a result of their mismanagement. And clearly this kind of unusual setting warrants careful and thorough federal review. HHS at the federal level is responsible for conducting oversight to combat waste, fraud, and abuse. It appears that all 3 were involved at Steward. And I appreciate Chairman Sanders and Ranking Member Cassidy for bringing the issue before our committee. But I regret we don't have someone here from the administration, either this administration or the prior administration, to talk about, okay, what should HHS be doing? How can we oversee, particularly in the case of hospitals in rural areas, that this doesn't happen? And is there something that needs to be done at the federal level to make sure that levels of care are being provided? Is there something done at the state level? I'll turn to you, Representative, which is what happens at the state level? Is there some state oversight where state regulators lax in this regard? I don't know to what degree the federal regulators should have been taking more aggressive action, or whether they had the authorities necessary to do that. But from your perspective, is there something the state can do or should do or did not do that would have prevented either the tragedies in your state or perhaps in other states like mine that have been so gravely affected as well?
So at the time, and thank you for the question, Senator, the Undersecretary, the Secretary of LDH started investigating in November of 2023, which led us up to the hearing in spring of 2024. They do have, through the medical jeopardy process, the ability to suspend or terminate the license for the facility, and that's the path we were headed down with this particular situation. Some states are more aggressive than others. I mean, when you look at shutting down a hospital and the potentially hurting more people because of that, this is how both private equity and these facilities get away with these schemes, because they put your facility in jeopardy. They shut them down. Your community has nothing, so they suffer even more. So then they can come to politicians like you and me and ask for additional bailout money and other lifelines, which to me is part of the broader crime. So to answer your question, yes, there are pathways for our departments of health to hold them accountable, but the question is the pain worth more than the punishment?
And do you believe that additional federal oversight is important or necessary in this regard?
So I think more broadly, when you look at how these schemes are funded, they come through, and Senator Sanders mentioned Medical Properties Trust. When they're fueling this private equity movement to be able to fund these schemes, then yes, there's federal oversight, and it starts with the SEC. I'm shocked that a real estate investment trust can have such large ownership of a facility or a company like Steward. That's not how REITs function. Federal law should prohibit those things. So there's a broader conversation on how you fund it, and then there's maybe a less broad conversation around specifically with the Department of Health and Hospitals on regulatory environments that disallow these types of operations to exist.
Great. Thank you. Mr. Chairman?
There's a good trajectory there.
Thank you. Senator Romney.
You have each spoken about, or not, I think almost everyone has spoken about a free and open internet, and I'm not sure entirely what that means. We would obviously believe that all of our information sources should be available. The Chinese and Russians and others would think all of their information should be available. There would also be massive disinformation. We're seeing that now. I mean, I wonder whether the day is coming when the American public stops looking at the internet for information because it's so overwhelmed with information coming from bots, made-up stories, made-up pictures. So when we talk about a free and open internet, I don't know precisely how you determine that. Are we gonna, if you will, censor Russian bots? I guess I think yes, but then it's no longer free and open. And how do you define a free and open internet? Because I'm sure Xi Jinping would say that's what we have. We have a free and open internet. All the information that people need to see, all the truth as he wants people to see it, is there. And we disagree. We think what they have is false. But so who determines and how do we assess what is a free and open internet? And do we limit disinformation? And who decides if it's disinformation? This is, I mean, obviously it's something we're struggling with just here at home. Mr. Kaye, you look like you have a comment on that.
No, thank you for that question, Senator Romney. It's a very good question, and it's an important question that I think is actually quite complex. At the international level, we have basic rights to freedom of opinion and expression. And it is a robust right, actually. The international right is the right to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers. So it's a right that it should enable us to access information. And when we think about subjects like disinformation and how you restrict that, once we start to go down that path, we actually start to give the authoritarians a kind of opening to censor because their view of what's disinformation is not our view of what's disinformation. So there are a few things that I would sort of point to here that I think are valuable for us to think about. First off, on the normative side, I hate to bring up norms, but the Human Rights Council, the UN General Assembly have very much pushed this idea that international human rights apply online as much as they do offline. And that is part of the normative shift that has happened within the international community. It is being pushed back against by China, by Russia, and by many others. I think we need to continue to push for the idea that individuals should have access to all kinds of information. I think we could also promote ideas that would essentially involve both the private sector and public actors in being involved in determining sort of the security that's required for people to engage online. I think this is a big part of what OTF does.
I'm going to interrupt just because I have to go to another hearing, and I want to just follow up a bit on this avenue of disinformation and open and free internet, what it means. Right now, an entity can publish an absolute lie and slander someone, libel someone, and there's no recourse for that individual because they don't know who did it. They don't know whether it's a bot or a person, and the internet company is free from liability as well, that the social media company. I don't know what the answer is to deal with this disinformation and slander and libel that occurs, and wonder, should we insist that the social media companies determine that there is an individual or an entity that's actually posting something on the internet, so that there is recourse if someone wants to bring an action against either a government or an institution or a person, as opposed to right now when there is absolutely no awareness whatsoever of who's behind a post and who's responsible for it. Ms. Cunningham, I'll turn to you, and Mr. Kay and Mr. Jeffrey. We haven't got much time, but any thoughts on that? All right.
More of a legal than a
all right, Kay, yeah.
Well,
Mr. Kay?
Well, I would say that we ought to look to actually the European regulation, the Digital Services Act, which tries to address this problem in a way that we haven't. And their fundamental approach is transparency on the one hand, but also risk assessment, an actual requirement that the companies conduct the kind of risk assessment to prevent the kind of harms that you're describing, and then requiring that there be some mechanisms of appeal for individuals who face these kinds of harms. It is a very tricky and narrow path to walk, I think, between demanding transparency and recourse and promoting and protecting rights to free speech. I think that's exactly where you're suggesting there's a problem, and I think that we could learn something from what the European Union has done in this case in trying to address this
trouble
problem.
if we got to learn from the Europeans, but maybe you're right. Mr. Jaffer, anything you want to say on that regard?
No, I think that's exactly.
By the way, I agree. That was humor. I agree. Yeah.
Well, actually, I actually worry that when we look at the European regulatory approach as the solution to America's problems on free speech, right? I actually think that could actually have significant innovation challenges. I think at the end of the day, what we've got to figure out is how do we protect anonymous speech, which there's a long history of in this country, right? While also addressing disinformation and misinformation, while also ensuring that we're providing capabilities to people who live in unfree societies to talk about the things they want to talk about and get the news from us. I have to say, I think the only solution to this challenging problem that you raised, Senator Romney, is recognizing that there's not a moral equivalence between what we do and what the Chinese do. When the Chinese or the Russians or the Iranians conduct surveillance, they do it in a one-party state with one control, no judges, no independent authorities. When we conduct surveillance, we've got to go to judges, we have to have review, Congress reviews it, there's a lot of oversight, and ultimately a judge weighs in. And so at the end of the day, I think that's the difference. It's not the same when we talk about their disinformation versus ours, or our legitimate information versus theirs. There's a fundamental distinction, and when we all embrace that fundamental distinction, I think at the end of the day, it's fine to put in place rules that require disclosure of names addressed when somebody's violating American or, in the right case, European law, right? And it's okay to say, no, China, Russia, you can't get that same thing because you're an authoritarian society. It's just a different system, and it's okay to say when they do it, it's different, and when we do it, it's okay.
Thank you, Senator Romney.
Have this witness here. Appreciate your willingness to be here. I don't know whether it's voluntary or not, but given the nature of our hearings, which are mostly opportunities for us to talk and you to listen, I appreciate your willingness to be here. I guess there were a couple of models that one could have for developing new drugs. One was the idea of a patent, which we'd say we want the private sector to invest massive amounts of money developing new products, new innovations, and then if one works, to have a patent to allow you to charge whatever you want to recoup a return on investment and make it potentially enormous profit. That's one model. The other model is to say, no, we the government are going to develop drugs and we're going to spend our money and keep the price down. Sometimes we live in a fantasy land which is we want you to invest, and the industry generally to invest massive amounts of money, but then we want you to keep the prices low. Like that's fantasy land. That's not real. That's not reality. You under our system are able to charge whatever you believe the market will bear and get as big a profit as you could possibly get. I presume that's you're a fiduciary for your shareholders. You're trying to maximize your profit. Is that right?
Senator, I agree with you that I'm not aware of any government that has developed a product. So it's typically done in the private sector, and that can only happen if there's patent protection. I don't think we set our price in a way where we just look at our shareholders, because we have also an obligation to set a price that it's available and affordable for patients.
Yeah, there's no question. Long term, your profit is going to be enhanced if people believe that you are good guys, not bad guys, and so there are a number of considerations in considering what's the best return. But there are a number of folks that would like you to invest a lot, but then to limit what you can get back, and somehow ascribe malevolent intent if you charge a high price. It's like that's the system we have. There are alternative systems, which is, no, we're going to limit how much you can get back. I look around the world, I don't recall a lot of drugs coming from China and Russia and North Korea and Iran. We don't see a lot of innovation coming from there. But yes, I would love a setting where you invested massive money, but then you gave us the products cheap. I mean, that's just not reality. And I wish there were a way of that to happen, but I don't see how that happens, and I very greatly appreciate the innovations that have been made by the industry. I do wonder what the reason is for the differences in price between what's available here in this country and what's available in some other countries. And I'm not now just talking about Wegovy and Ozempic, and I don't know the pricing differences to the extent they exist around the world. But we in this country often talk about how products are much cheaper in Canada and the UK and France and Germany than they are here. Why is that? Why are we so out of line with the rest of the world in terms of the pricing that comes from the industry? Not necessarily your own company, but the industry at large.
Yes, I think there are, Senator, a number of differences if you, for instance, compare US and European market. If you look at all the innovation that's made, a lot of it made in this country, so the economic activity taking place here, all of those innovative products in 85% of the cases get to the market in the US. It's only around 40% in Europe. So in Europe, there's a sanction of healthcare, there's a rationing of who gets access. So the latest innovations are not getting to my countrymen, but they are in most cases getting to the US. So there's a different perspective in how you look at innovation. And when we look at the diseases we're talking about here, diabetes and obesity, these are very, very expensive diseases. And we talk about the cost of the medicine, but typically in these diseases, the cost of the medicine is less than 10% of the total disease burden. If you look at chronic kidney disease, where we have shown in our data that for people living with type 2 diabetes and start using Ozempic, you reduce the risk of developing chronic kidney disease by 24%. And actually a quarter of all Medicare cost goes to people living with kidney disease. So using innovation is a really big opportunity for driving down the cost of the US healthcare system. And there is a general openness for that type of innovation in the US market, which is not always the case in Europe. That comes with a cost, but it also leads to significant benefits for the individual Americans, but also for the healthcare system in saved cost for these chronic diseases.
I would anticipate that in European countries that don't have access to some of the life-saving products that are available here, that there would be a huge hue and cry on the part of the public saying, why can't we have these products? But those that are available in both places, I don't understand why the price should be different. If the French and the Germans and the Canadians honor our patents, would the companies not be free then to charge the same price there that they charge here? Why charge a lower price there than is charged here?
So it's a great question. When we compare the prices, it's not an apple-to-apple comparison. It's typically different prices that's being compared, and it's typically the list price in the U.S. And in the U.S., there's not one price. There are a number of different prices. So when we sell our products in Medicaid, in VAs, we get a really, really low price. We even have support programs where we pay for the medicine for Americans. There are no other place where we give products away for free. That's only in the US. When I look at the government, what the government pays for our insulins, that is now less than what many governments pay in Europe. But that's typically lost in the whole translation and referencing to list pricing, which is not the price we get. So unfortunately, as also the chairman said at the opening, it is a very complex market and very complex healthcare system that creates a lot of misunderstandings.
Yeah, I must admit, I agree. The complexity of our PBM system is such that it's very hard for us to figure out just exactly who's getting what and why. And I happen to believe that one of the reasons our healthcare cost is so expensive, particularly as it relates to pharmaceuticals, is the opaque nature of our pricing in this country. Thank you, Mr. Jorgensen.